I became High Commissioner for Human Rights in September 2008, and during that month it's always the high-level summit in New York where all the heads of state attend. So that was my first, and I received a specific request that the President of Sri Lanka wished to see me. So it was President Rajapaksa, and he told me that he is about to embark on a huge campaign to end terrorism in his country, and that I should not criticize him. So when someone tells you not to do something, then you pay particular attention to that issue. During my 6-year, 10 years UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, my office faced resistance and obstruction. Instead of cooperation to end human rights violations or cooperation to investigate them from the states concerned, in almost all the Human Rights Council mandated commissions of inquiry, including 6 into Israeli Defense Force operations in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territory, investigations into Syria, Sri Lanka, and DPRK, the countries concerned denied access to our investigators. The OHCHR investigation team was not granted access to Sri Lanka by both the previous government and the current government. The UN report mandated by the Human Rights Council, published on 16 September 2015, identified patterns of grave violations in Sri Lanka between 2002 and 2011, strongly indicating that war crimes and crimes against humanity were most likely to have been committed by both sides to the conflict. Among the most serious crimes documented in the report are unlawful killings, including suicide bombings, mine attacks, and assassinations of public officials, academics, humanitarians, and dissenting Tamil figures. So I was just listing a few of the results of the investigations conducted, for instance, on Sri Lanka. Sexual and gender-based violence within and outside interrogation sessions as part of a policy to inflict torture. Enforced disappearances involving tens of thousands of Sri Lankans, recruitment of children and their use in hostilities, attacks on civilians and civilian objects, such as the shelling by government forces of hospitals and humanitarian facilities in the densely populated no-fire zones, denial of humanitarian assistance, violations during the detention of internally displaced people, such as treating Tamil IDPs as suspects, and deprivation of liberty in camps for long periods in violation of international law. My successor, High Commissioner Zaid, notes the high levels of mistrust in state authorities and institutions in Sri Lanka, a fact that I also noted when I visited Sri Lanka as High Commissioner. For this reason, the report recommends the establishment of a hybrid special court integrating international judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and investigators as an essential step towards justice. Zaid welcomed the positive steps taken by the new government of President Maithripala Sirisena since January 2015, but he said that Sri Lanka must now move forward to dismantle the repressive structures and institutional cultures that remain deeply entrenched after decades of erosion of human rights. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes to recall my own visit to Sri Lanka in August 2013 and some of my impressions. An important realization was that although the fighting was over, the suffering was not. I was extremely moved by the profound trauma I had seen among the relatives of the missing and the dead and the war survivors in all the places I visited, as well as their resilience. This was particularly evident amongst those scratching out a living among the ghosts of burnt and shelled trees, ruined houses, and other debris of the final battle of the war along the lagoon in Mullaitivu. I stated that wounds will not heal and reconciliation will not happen without respect for those who grieve and remembrance for the tens of thousands of Tamils, Sinhalese, Muslims and others who died before their time on the battlefield, in buses, on the street or in detention. As one wife of a missing man put it to me, even when we eat, we keep a portion for him. I met another mother who told me that after the war, she encouraged her son, who had been involved in LTTE activities. She encouraged him to give himself up to the authorities, and she put him on the bus. And that's the last she saw of him. And that's what she wants to know. What has happened to my son? And this is why I stress very much that the disappearance is a major issue and must be investigated. I held meetings with a Jesuit priest who had gathered information about all those who had disappeared, just names and where they came from. And I was deeply offended that as soon as we left, the authorities went and harassed that Jesuit priest on what he had told me. I was also concerned to hear about the degree to which the military appears to be putting down roots and becoming involved in what should be civilian activities, for instance, education, agriculture, and even tourism. I also heard complaints about the acquisition of private land to build military camps and installations, including a holiday resort. This is only going to make the complex land issues with which the government has been grappling even more complicated and difficult to resolve. So I said that clearly the army does need some camps, but the prevalence and level of involvement of soldiers in the community seem much greater than is needed for strictly military or reconstruction purposes. I was very concerned to hear about the vulnerability of women and girls in the north, especially in female-headed households, to sexual harassment and abuse. I raised this issue with several ministers, the provincial governors and senior military commanders who attended my meeting with the Secretary of Defense. I challenged them to rigorously enforce a zero-tolerance policy of sexual abuse. Not all of it may be sexual abuse, but it is still abuse when soldiers knock on the door of a woman living alone at 4 in the morning, entering a house and just sitting in their lounge for hours. This totally discredits her in her community. I followed up on the status of detainees and urged the government to expedite their cases. I also suggested that it was time to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which has long been cause for concern. And because of the legacy of massive trauma, I felt there was a desperate need for counseling and psychosocial support in the North. And I do encourage those of you who could help with that kind of counseling. At the time I was there, the government stopped the psychosocial support for the survivors. And as I said, I met many relatives of missing or disappeared civilians and also soldiers who were still hoping to discover, the families of soldiers who were waiting to discover the whereabouts of their loved ones. And they emphasized the urgent need to resolve this issue. I asked for information about the new Commission of Inquiry on Disappearances and stressed the need for it to be more effective than the previous 5 commissions of this kind. And that was the troubling feature about Sri Lanka, that none of the commissions and investigations were ever brought to fruit or made known or provided any remedies. Another disturbing aspect of my visit was the harassment and intimidation of a number of human rights defenders, at least 2 priests, journalists, and many ordinary citizens who met with me or planned to meet with me. The first meeting that was arranged for me was actually arranged by the government, and they wanted me to see the religious leaders. And they were all there, the religious leaders, handpicked by the government, of course. But this one young Catholic priest, he stood up, and then he just burst into tears, and he could not speak. The others were telling him, get on with it, but he could not speak. When I was leaving, I asked to see him, and he said to me in Tamil, "I cannot say the things they want me to say." So therefore I focused very much on the harassment of people practicing other religions, such as the fact that almost 100 mosques were damaged by government forces or their supporters. I found a great deal of surveillance and harassment, which appeared to be getting worse, and critical voices were being suppressed, and it was particularly extraordinary for such treatment to be meted out during my visit. I stressed that the United Nations takes the issue of reprisals against people just because they have talked to UN officials as an extremely serious matter. So I went into some details about Sri Lanka because I'm going on to my theme and how disturbing it is that the international community, despite drawing all this wonderful framework and treaties for us, has consistently failed to react strongly and quickly to crises and conflicts in the world, including situations of grave human rights violations with high potential for regional overspill. As we see now, this overspill from Syria into Iraq. The Security Council was not able to make a collective response to end the carnage in Syria. My call for the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court was supported by signatures of some 60 countries, mainly in Europe. The lack of consensus on Syria and the resulting inaction, as you could see, has been disastrous, and civilians have been massacred in their thousands, and millions suffered displacement, now seen as the refugee crisis in Europe. The struggle against impunity is challenged also by double standards and selectivity. Many in Africa and in my own country are questioning why the Security Council referred only states from Africa, namely Darfur, Sudan, and Libya, to the International Criminal Court, but not the attack on Iraq by the United States, or the conflict in Syria, or the conflict in Sri Lanka, which blazed on our TV screens, so that we all saw the indiscriminate shelling over civilians. So at the very least, if the United Nations is to make good on its commitment to protect civilians, it must be resolute, undivided, and clear about its intention. Had this been the case with Sri Lanka in 2009, or now in Sudan, Syria, Central African Republic, or even Burundi and Myanmar, the consequences for the lives of millions of people would be immense. In my addresses to the UN Security Council, I have called for a broader conception of national interest to guide the work of the Security Council, given its charter mandate as the guardian of international peace and security. Preventing human rights violations is not only a moral obligation, it is in the collective interest of nation states and people everywhere. As High Commissioner, I have often lamented the failure of some states to place the collective interest above short-term geopolitical considerations and narrow definitions of national interest, leading to persistent failures to take action in situations where, for example, action was necessary to ensure accountability for gross violations of international law. I have often said that states should hold their foes or their enemies to the same standard to account as they do their friends. But even when the vote was going on one of the early resolutions on Sri Lanka in the Human Rights Council, even my own country, South Africa, which benefited so much in collective action by the international community to end apartheid, particularly through the United Nations. Yes, South Africa raised the argument that it would be interfering in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka to adopt a resolution asking them to investigate the violations. And of course, the failure of the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court and the persistent use of the veto power to block action over the Israeli-Palestine conflict, especially over alleged war crimes committed during the operations in Gaza, are crucial reminders to us of double standards. While 124 states, a clear majority, have ratified the Rome Statute, 3 of the P5, the 5 veto-holding states, 3 of them, United States, China, and Russia, have refused to subject themselves to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and join in its goal of upholding the rule of law and ending impunity. And this is perceived as unjust and selective justice. Yet they have the power of the veto over referrals to the International Criminal Court, and they have the power to stop actions in situations of mass crimes and serious human rights and humanitarian law violations. Sri Lanka was never placed on the agenda of any of the United Nations fora, Security Council or the General Assembly, and it only came before the Human Rights Council because of the panel set up by the Secretary General and because of your actions in pressuring governments in the areas where you stay to support this resolution in the Human Rights Council. So what I'm saying is it should be apparent that while international accountability processes have contributed immensely to challenging impunity for serious violations of international law, and they have engendered increased global awareness of such crimes, such measures cannot operate in a vacuum, nor are they sufficient by themselves to stop the cycle of violations. The biggest stumbling block has been the lack of political will on the part of governments. It is for this reason, among others, that I have supported calls for more proactive measures on the part of states and the international community for early warning, preventive diplomacy, and conflict prevention, in addition to measures to deal with the consequences of conflict. As I've often emphasized, peace, development, security cannot be addressed in isolation of human rights. So thank you very much for this opportunity to address you.